The dust in Red Rock Canyon tasted like copper and old resentment. It was a suffocating late August afternoon in 1876. The air hung thick and heavy, a humid, oppressive blanket even in the high desert, trapping the odors of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and something metallic that lingered around the back alleys of the town's only respectable business, Titus's Meat Market. A new face had just stepped off the stagecoach, a young man named Elias Vance. He was a bookish, clean-shaven Easterner, dressed in a lightweight tweed suit that looked hopelessly out of place against the backdrop of sun-baked adobe and rough-hewn timber. Elias clutched a worn leather satchel containing a surveyor's map and a letter of introduction. He was sent by the territorial government to assess the land claims around the burgeoning mining operations. His mission was boring and bureaucratic, but the moment his boots hit the dry earth, a chill entirely unconnected to the oppressive heat ran down his spine. Red Rock Canyon was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of stillness that suggested not peace, but a held breath. The main street, a stretch of rutted dirt, was flanked by a handful of businesses: the Golden Nugget Saloon, a general store, a livery, and the aforementioned butcher shop. People moved with a strange, almost mechanical languor. Their eyes, when they met Elias's, held an unnerving blankness, a subtle caution that felt more like fear than frontier reserve. Elias walked the short distance to the Golden Nugget, his footsteps the loudest sound in the canyon. He pushed through the swinging doors, and the noise level jumped. A sudden cacophony of piano music, drunken laughter, and the clack of poker chips. He ordered a sarsaparilla, a non-alcoholic concession to the heat, and leaned against the bar, trying to blend in. "You're new," the bartender, a hulking man with a scarred face and surprisingly gentle eyes, stated more than asked. Elias Vance, government surveyor, just arrived. The bartender, whose name was Silas, paused while wiping a glass. "Best keep your business quiet, Mr. Vance. Folks here don't take kindly to outsiders poking around their claims." "I'm just mapping boundaries, Silas. Nothing to do with ownership." Elias watched a group of men huddled around a table, their conversation a low, fervent drone. One of them was chewing something dark and stringy with an unsettling intensity. "Mapping boundaries can change ownership quick enough out here," Silas muttered. He then leaned in, lowering his voice. "If you need to know anything about Red Rock, you talk to the man who owns it, in a way. Titus, the butcher." Elias followed Silas's gaze to the far corner of the saloon. There, isolated at a small table, sat a man who dominated the room without speaking. Titus was immense, with shoulders like anvines and a square, impassive face, partially obscured by a thick, dark beard. He wore a heavy, blood-stained apron over his clothes, an odd choice for sitting in a saloon, but no one seemed to notice. On the table beside his mug of beer was a small, unmarked wooden box. "Heard a lot about him," Elias said, recalling the whispered warnings on the stagecoach. "Hard worker," they said. "Hard doesn't cover it," Silas corrected, his voice flat. "Titus was the one who brought order to this place a year back. We had a problem with an overseer from the east, a man named Garrett. Cruel man, the kind who thought his money entitled him to everything, including the souls of the men working the claims. Titus dealt with him, quietly, efficiently. The next day, Garrett was gone, and Titus started selling his famous jerky, best in the territory. Sells out, every day." Elias glanced back at the men around the poker table, the ones chewing the dark meat. His stomach turned, not just from the suggestion, but from the unsettling pride in Silas's voice when he mentioned the famous jerky. "And the town was better for it?" Elias asked, his tone carefully neutral. Silas gave a low chuckle that held no humor. "The town became stable for it. Fear is a good mortar, Mr. Vance, and money is better. Titus controls the supply of the only thing everyone here craves, and he controls the mood of this place. No questions asked, no problems. That's the Red Rock way now." Elias took a long, tasteless sip of his sarsaparilla. The situation felt heavy, thick with unspoken complicity. The townspeople were not victims in the traditional sense. They were participants in a silence enforced by a single, terrifying act of brutality and its profitable, ongoing aftermath. The absence of Garrett was a presence that permeated every dry, dusty corner of Red Rock. Just then, Titus slowly rose from his table. His movement was deliberate, unhurried, yet it instantly dampened the noise in the saloon. He picked up his wooden box, his eyes briefly sweeping across the room. When they landed on Elias, they held no hostility, only a flat, chilling assessment. The look a butcher gives a marketable steer. Elias felt a desperate need to establish his authority, however flimsy it was. He straightened up. "Mr. Titus," he called out, his voice sounding too loud, too thin. "Elias Vance, territorial surveyor. I intend to walk the south boundary tomorrow morning. I'll need a local to confirm landmarks." Titus stopped at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He turned his head slowly, the movement almost reptilian. "The south boundary is mine, Mr. Vance," Titus said, his voice a gravelly, low sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You want landmarks? You come to my shop at dawn. Bring your own water, and don't ask questions about the meat. It's what keeps this town alive." With that, Titus disappeared through the swinging doors, leaving behind a profound silence and the faint, coppery scent of his butcher's apron. Elias stood frozen, his bureaucratic task suddenly transformed into a terrifying descent into a human drama of survival, corruption, and a pervasive, deeply unsettling mystery. He was not just mapping land. He was mapping the boundaries of the town's collective soul, and they were stained with a darkness he had not anticipated. The terror was not in the threat of violence, but in the chilling accepted normalcy of what had already been done. If you've made it this far, the terror has just begun. Don't get lost in the dust of Red Rock Canyon. Make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single shocking turn of the story. The night in Red Rock Canyon offered no genuine respite. Elias Vance lay on a creaking cot in the dusty back room of the general store, the only lodging available. The heat persisted, and so did the metallic, coppery scent that seemed to waft on the slightest breeze. Sleep was fractured, filled with images of Titus's impassive eyes and the sight of men in the saloon chewing the dark, sinewy jerky. The unspoken horror of what was implied, that the product keeping the town stable was the remains of the cruel overseer Garrett, pressed down on his chest. It was a macabre, terrifying foundation upon which the town was built. He rose before the sun, the sky a deep, bruised purple just beginning to lighten. Elias traded his tweed jacket for a rough canvas coat, a concession to the desert morning chill and a feeble attempt to look less like a target. He strapped a sturdy utility knife to his belt, a meager defense, but a necessary prop for his nerves. Titus's meat market was located on the edge of town, a low-slung, sturdy building that looked more like a fortress than a shop. The smell was intense here, a mingling of cured spices, heavy smoke from the jerky operation, and the sickly sweet tang of blood that had soaked into the wood and earth over time. A single lantern cast a yellow, sickly glow on the entrance. Elias found Titus already working. The butcher stood over a massive, grease-stained wooden block, his back to the door. He wasn't butchering anything at the moment. He was sharpening a row of terrifyingly large knives, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on stone, a sound that immediately heightened Elias's anxiety. "You're early, Surveyor Vance," Titus said without turning around, his voice low and steady, lacking any greeting. "Just following your instruction, Mr. Titus. I prefer to start work before the heat sets in." Elias walked further into the shop. The interior was meticulously clean for a butcher's, but the tools, the hooks, the cleavers, the saws, were monumental, giving the space the atmosphere of an execution chamber. Behind a counter, drying on racks, hung hundreds of pieces of the infamous jerky, dark as mahogany and smelling powerfully of chili and hickory smoke. The landmarks are simple. Titus finally turned, his massive frame filling the light. He carried a large map, old and brittle, rolled under his arm. The south claim begins at the Devil's Tooth Rock Formation, a spire you can't miss. Runs due west for 3 miles to the old water pump, then due north back to the canyon rim. You're charting mining territory, not picnic spots. Elias unrolled his own government-issued map, a pristine contrast to Titus's worn document. My job requires precision, Mr. Titus. I need to be sure the claims match the government registry. The previous surveyor's notes were incomplete. Garrett's notes were complete enough for him, Titus scoffed. He laid his calloused finger on Elias's map, directly over the Devil's Tooth. Look at the soil here, the rich red iron oxide. That's what Garrett came for. That's what I manage now. The land, the claims, the workers, they all respond to a firm hand. Garrett's was too firm and too greedy. Mine is simply effective. Titus's phrasing was a masterclass in sinister ambiguity. He was admitting to the disposal of Garrett and the seizing of control, but in a way that defied direct accusation. He hadn't confessed to murder, only to a managerial takeover. And the jerky, Elias ventured, trying to keep his voice steady as he looked at the dark, dried meat. The question was a gamble, a direct push against the town's collective silence. Titus paused, his dark eyes locking onto Elias. The atmosphere in the shop grew instantly colder. You are a surveyor, Mr. Vance. You concern yourself with boundaries on paper. I concern myself with boundaries of necessity. People need sustenance. I provide it. He walked over to the racks, and with a casualness that was deeply unsettling, tore off a piece of the jerky. He held it out to Elias. The secret is the cure. Long, slow process. Takes the edge off the meat, makes it palatable, desirable. It's the best preservative in the desert. Try it. Elias's throat was dry. Refusal would be an explicit accusation. Acceptance, a terrifying form of complicity. He knew he had to play the game to survive. He reached out and took the piece of jerky. It was tough, slightly greasy, and warm from the nearby smoker. You shouldn't disrespect the source of the town's prosperity, surveyor, Titus warned, his voice soft, almost a fatherly reprimand. This jerky feeds the miners, keeps them strong, keeps them quiet. It keeps Red Rock Canyon stable. Garrett's cruelty, his waste, would have ruined this place. I created something valuable from something worthless. Elias took a small, agonizing bite. The initial flavor was overwhelmingly spiced, chili, pepper, and something earthy. He chewed slowly, fighting the urge to gag, forcing himself to swallow the tough, stringy texture. It tasted like intensely cured meat, but with a faint, unusual savoriness he couldn't quite place. It's potent, Elias managed, forcing a nod. Titus smiled, a slow, predatory widening of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. Potent indeed. Now about that south boundary. You walk it today. You see the Devil's Tooth. You make your marks. You do your job. And you keep your surveyor's nose out of the butcher's business. Unless, of course, you'd like to become a consultant. The implication hung in the air. Help Titus consolidate his power and his secret, or risk becoming another element of his efficiency. Elias felt a cold determination solidify within him. He would walk the boundary, but he would also be looking for more than just rock spires and old pumps. He would be looking for proof, for anything that could expose the horrifying truth and free this trapped, fear-ridden community from the butcher's iron grip. The key lay not just in the meat, but in the unsettling stability the town had embraced. He knew he was walking straight into the heart of the canyon's darkness. He left the shop and headed out into the rising sun, the taste of the jerky a metallic, bitter stain in his mouth, the scent of the meat market an invisible shroud clinging to his clothes. His map was a tool, but his real work had become an investigation of human depravity and the terrifying power of fear and control. Elias spent the early morning hours riding a rented mule south, following the faint trail that led out of Red Rock Canyon. The dry, undulating terrain was difficult to navigate, and the sun, now fully risen, was beginning its relentless bake. The land was unforgiving, and the air of menace from the town seemed to follow him like a physical heat haze. He reached the Devil's Tooth, a jagged, iron-rich spire of rock that thrust violently from the canyon floor. It was a perfect, unmistakable landmark. According to Titus, this was the start of the southern claim boundary. Elias dismounted and began the painstaking process of confirming the coordinates with his surveying equipment. As he worked, he noticed something unnatural near the base of the rock formation. The ground here was slightly disturbed, a shallow depression covered by loose shale and a few pieces of scrub brush. The disturbance was subtle, easily missed, but Elias's training made him observant. He pulled out a small collapsible shovel from his satchel and began to scrape away the top layer of earth. The digging was difficult in the hard-packed soil, but his curiosity and the persistent, chilling suggestion of Titus's confession pushed him on. After 10 minutes of labor, he uncovered a piece of cloth, a heavy, woven material, gray with dust, but which he recognized instantly as part of a high-quality coat, likely tailored. He carefully brushed away more dirt and uncovered a small, tarnished brass button. It was a type common on expensive Eastern-style frock coats. This, he surmised, was where Overseer Garrett had met his end, or at least where his final moments had transpired. The shallow scrape in the earth was not a grave, but perhaps the site of a struggle, or where Titus had done the initial necessary work of his grim task. Elias quickly recovered the pieces of cloth and the button, wrapping them carefully in a piece of oiled paper and securing them deep within his satchel. He had his first tangible evidence, not of murder, which was still circumstantial, but of a disappearance linked directly to the area Titus claimed as his boundary. He continued due west, walking the 3 miles toward the old water pump, mentally recording his measurements. The heat was becoming unbearable, but he forced himself to focus, using the physical exertion to stave off the psychological terror. 2 miles in, the terrain dipped into a small, dry ravine. Here the signs of recent activity were more pronounced. He found a makeshift fire pit, much larger than one used for camping, and the remains of heavy ash, mixed with splintered bone fragments. He knelt and examined the fragments. They were too small and too thoroughly burned to identify, but they added another chilling layer to the narrative. Titus hadn't just killed Garrett. He had systematically and thoroughly disposed of him, using every part of the remains to serve his twisted purpose. As Elias was cataloging the site, he heard the faint, rhythmic pounding of a horse's hooves approaching from the north, the direction of the canyon rim. He quickly covered the ashes with loose earth and stood up, trying to appear nonchalant, focused only on his surveying chain. A rider emerged over the rise, a burly, weathered man who Elias recognized as one of the silent poker players from the Golden Nugget Saloon. The man slowed his horse, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Long way from the saloon, surveyor," the rider called out, his voice a rough drawl. "Just following the coordinates, sir," Elias replied, keeping his tone professional and slightly bored. "The line runs straight for the old pump, then turns north." The rider dismounted, his hand casually resting near the pistol holstered on his hip. "Titus said you'd be thorough, just making sure you ain't doing any extra surveying. This is Titus's land now. He pays the miners, he feeds the town. Nobody messes with the claim lines. My job is documentation, not litigation," Elias stated, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "I'm here to prevent future disputes, not start new ones." The man took a slow, deliberate walk around Elias, his gaze taking in the surveyor's equipment, the disturbed ground, and Elias's nervous posture. He stopped directly in front of the slight depression Elias had been digging in. "Looks like you've been digging up more than coordinates, Vance," the rider said, a threat coiled tightly in his voice. Just confirming the soil composition, Elias lied smoothly, pointing to a small bag of earth samples he'd collected, a standard part of his actual work. Trying to correlate the iron content along the boundary. It affects the magnetic readings. The rider stared hard at him, clearly skeptical, but the explanation was technical enough to sound legitimate. After a tense moment, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Don't push your luck, Easterner. Stay on the line. Titus has eyes everywhere. The rider remounted and rode off, leaving Elias shaken, but intact. The encounter confirmed two terrifying things. Titus used the townspeople as his watchful eyes, and the secret of Garrett's fate was a matter of conscious, communal silence. The residents of Red Rock Canyon were not simply being fooled. They were complicit in the horror, exchanging the life of a cruel overseer for the stability and food provided by the butcher. Elias watched the rider disappear. He still had miles to walk, but the greatest obstacle was no longer the terrain. It was the vast, terrifying silence of a corrupted town. He held the button and the cloth tightly in his satchel, a small, dark seed of truth that he needed to cultivate into an undeniable force against Titus. He had to proceed with extreme caution, knowing that his life depended on his ability to blend his official duties with his secret, perilous investigation. The next morning, Elias returned to Red Rock Canyon, exhausted but galvanized. He spent the afternoon working in the general store's back room, meticulously transcribing his field notes. He had drawn his boundaries, but his mind was on the horrific details he had uncovered, especially the burnt fragments in the ravine. He went to the Golden Nugget Saloon that evening. Titus was not there, which offered a brief, fragile sense of relief. Elias took a seat at the bar, nursing a bitter coffee, and motioned for Silas, the bartender, to approach. "Silas, I need to know more about Garrett," Elias said, keeping his voice a low, urgent whisper. "The overseer." What kind of man was he, really? Silas's hands stopped drying a mug. He didn't look up. "He was a monster, Mr. Vance. Plain and simple. He came here with a crew of thugs, hired to squeeze every cent of iron ore out of the ground. He withheld wages, beat men who complained, and starved anyone who tried to leave. He was preparing to file a petition to claim the entire water rights for himself. He was going to own us, body and soul. And Titus? Titus was a miner, quiet, strong. He came in one day, bought the old slaughterhouse, it was abandoned, and just started working. He never said much. But when Garrett disappeared, the beatings stopped. The wages, though low, were paid. And the jerky started flowing. It was a brutal balance, but it was balance. Elias leaned closer. Was there anyone else involved? Anyone who helped Titus with the disposal? Silas finally looked up, his eyes grave and weary. "No one saw anything, Mr. Vance. That's the key." One morning, Garrett's horse was tied up outside the market, but Garrett was gone. Titus was in his shop, smoking meat. He never spoke a word of it, but every man in this town knows he saved us, and in the desert, a full belly is a silent tongue. Elias knew he couldn't push Silas further on the direct evidence. He changed tack. Titus is running a business. Butcher shops need ledgers, inventory. Where would he keep his records? Silas hesitated, glancing around the half-empty saloon. The market has a strong room in the back, reinforced. He keeps everything locked up there, cash, receipts, whatever accounts he keeps. "I need to see those records, Silas," Elias said, his urgency clear. "If I can find any inconsistency in his supply, if the records don't show the purchase of the meat that became that jerky, I have the first piece of undeniable official proof." Silas's expression tightened into a mask of fear. "You're talking about suicide, Mr. Vance. Titus's lockup is impenetrable, and if he even suspects you're looking at his business, you're done. The whole town will turn on you." "I'm running out of time," Elias confessed. "I'm due back in the territorial office in 2 weeks. I need to make a move." Later that night, the moon was thin and the air was still when Elias made his way to Titus's meat market. He approached from the rear, slipping into the dark, narrow alleyway behind the shop. The metallic odor was overpowering here, mingling with the smell of waste and dried spices. The strong room, as Silas had described it, was a separate, windowless structure attached to the back of the main building. It had a single, heavy door, secured with a massive old-fashioned padlock. The lock was formidable, but Elias had prepared. He carried a small, specialized toolkit, a collection of picks and tension wrenches he had acquired from a professional safecracker during his brief, misspent youth in the East, a skill he never thought he would need in the line of duty. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the frantic pounding in his ears. He knelt by the lock, his fingers trembling as he inserted the thin steel picks. He worked for what felt like an eternity, the minutes stretching into an oppressive void of darkness and anxiety. Finally, with a soft metallic click, the lock mechanism yielded. Elias slowly, painstakingly lifted the heavy padlock and slid the bolt back. He pushed the door inward. The room inside was pitch black. Elias lit a small shielded lantern he carried, its light illuminating a cramped space filled with shelves of canned goods, sacks of flour, and most importantly, a heavy, iron-bound chest secured on a thick wooden table. Elias ignored the chest for the moment. On a top shelf, he spotted what he was looking for, a series of thick, canvas-bound notebooks, Titus's ledgers. He pulled down the most recent one, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. The handwriting inside was surprisingly neat, the entries meticulous. Elias flipped through the pages, examining the records of cattle purchases, feed costs, sales, and inventory. The discovery was immediate and stunning. For the last 11 months, the period following Garrett's disappearance, Titus's ledger showed a consistent, steady purchase of low-grade beef and pork for general market sales. But for the jerky production, the ledger was unsettlingly vague. The entries simply read, "Special reserve meat stock, no cost, for the key ingredient that was processed, cured and sold for massive profit throughout the territory." There was no record of where this special reserve came from, no invoice, no supplier. The only entry was the zero cost, which meant pure, untraceable profit. Elias carefully copied the damning evidence onto a slip of paper. He didn't dare remove the original ledger. As he was finishing, a floorboard in the main butcher shop creaked loudly. Elias froze, extinguishing the lantern instantly. His blood turned to ice. He was not alone. Titus was back. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps was moving closer, slow and inexorable, toward the back of the shop. Elias pressed himself against the rough stone wall of the strongroom, barely breathing. The shadow of Titus's enormous frame fell across the open doorway. The air in the strongroom grew suffocating. Elias could hear the steady, heavy sound of Titus's breathing just inches from the doorway. He pressed his back flat against the wall, the rough stone biting into his canvas coat. His mind raced, calculating the odds of a quick, silent escape. 0. Titus stood in the open doorway for a long, agonizing minute. Elias could feel the butcher's presence, an immense, dark void. It seemed impossible that Titus could not hear the frantic pounding of Elias's heart, or smell the lingering scent of his own fear. Finally, Titus moved. He didn't enter the room. Instead, he reached a huge hand in, his fingers briefly brushing the table where Elias had placed the ledger, and grabbed a small tin of peppercorns off a nearby shelf. He pulled his hand back, and the sound of his footsteps receded back into the main shop, heavy and slow. Elias waited for another 10 minutes, listening for any sound of a return. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. He knew he couldn't stay. He slipped out of the strong room, carefully and silently replacing the heavy padlock and closing the bolt, making sure it looked exactly as it had before he touched it. He moved like a shadow through the alleyway and retreated back to the general store, the evidence of the special reserve meat stock burning in his pocket. The next morning, Elias felt the eyes of the town on him more intensely than ever. He went about his surveying duties, but with a new layer of paranoia. He decided to pay a visit to the one person he hadn't yet spoken to, Mrs. Gable, the elderly owner of the general store. She was an observer, a quiet fixture who saw the ebb and flow of the town's life. He found her meticulously arranging bolts of fabric. Her face was lined with the hard geography of the desert, but her eyes were sharp. "Mrs. Gable, I need to understand the time before Titus," Elias began, leaning over the counter. "Specifically, the supply of meat. Garrett had control of everything, didn't he?" Mrs. Gable sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Garrett controlled everything he could get his claws on, Surveyor Vance. The claims, the wages, the water, and the food. Before Titus, the miners were near starving. Garrett had a small private supply of dried rations for himself and his thugs, and he sold the meager local beef supply at outrageous prices. People were desperate. Malnutrition was common. And when Titus took over, it was instant. He opened the market, and within a week he had this jerky, abundant, cheap. It's what saved this town from collapse or a violent revolt. It's the only reliable source of protein the miners get, besides the occasional jackrabbit." Elias noted the phrasing, "reliable source of protein." He pushed gently. "Did Titus buy any large shipments of cattle or pigs right when he started? Enough to supply the entire town with this famous jerky?" Mrs. Gable shook her head slowly. "No, sir. We all noticed that. He bought a few steers for the standard cuts, steaks and chops. But the jerky? He started with what looked like a small supply, and it just never ran out. He smokes it daily, always in the back. Says it's a family recipe that uses meat scraps no one else wants. But he never, ever buys the bulk to match the output." This was the final confirmation. The ledgers showed no cost for the supply, and the general store owner confirmed there were no incoming shipments to justify the production volume. The meat had to be coming from a local, non-standard source, one that cost Titus nothing, yet was highly profitable. "What about Garrett's personal guards?" Elias asked. "The men he brought with him, did they leave with him?" Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered with fear. "No, they left about a week after Garrett disappeared. They packed their horses and rode out empty-handed. They were terrified. Said they heard things in the night, that they couldn't stay. They abandoned everything they'd stolen and fled." Elias felt a new, horrifying wave of realization wash over him. Titus hadn't just eliminated Garrett. He had established the entire operation before the body was fully utilized. The sight of Garrett's horse tied outside the market was a chilling display of ownership and control. The town saw it as deliverance, but it was a calculated takeover built on terror and human remains. The complexity of Titus's plan was staggering. Eliminate the tyrant, use the body as a resource for the needy town, and solidify his power as the town's savior and supplier, all while enforcing a code of silence through complicity and fear. The psychological terror was in the acceptance of the horror. Elias thanked Mrs. Gable and stepped back out into the bright, dusty street. He had the evidence, the button and cloth, the burnt remnants, the ledger note, and the confirmed lack of meat supply. But he lacked one thing, a witness, someone who saw the initial act, or someone who could testify to the true nature of the jerky. He knew he couldn't go to the local sheriff, who was likely either bought or terrified. He had to gather enough proof to present to the territorial marshal himself. He had to find something definitive, something that could not be burned or concealed, something about Garrett's private life that could be used against Titus. His focus turned to the one place in town where secrets were traded freely, the Golden Nugget Saloon. He needed to spend time there, to listen to the men who were chewing the very evidence of the crime, hoping one of them, under the influence of whiskey, might let slip a crucial detail about Garrett that could break the silence. Elias spent the next 3 evenings at the Golden Nugget. He didn't drink alcohol, but he made a point of sitting near the poker table, subtly listening to the miners. He ordered food, but meticulously avoided the jerky, a decision Silas noticed with a subtle nod of understanding. The miners talked about claims, ore grades, and the weather. They never spoke of Garrett, and they never spoke of Titus, except to confirm an order for more meat. The silence was an unbreachable wall, reinforced by shared self-preservation. On the 4th night, a new opportunity presented itself. A young miner, thin and jumpy, named Jedediah, had been losing heavily at poker. He was drinking rot-gut whiskey at a frightening pace, his face flushed, his frustration palpable. Jedediah finally slammed his last coin onto the table and lost the hand. He staggered back from the table, cursing loudly. Elias saw his chance. He motioned to Silas to bring Jedediah a strong coffee, spiking it with a bit of his own medicinal brandy, a gesture of sympathy. Jedediah accepted the coffee sullenly. Elias sat across from him. "Tough luck, Jedediah. Long week?" "Every week is a long week in this dust," Jedediah slurred. He took a sip of the doctored coffee, and his demeanor softened marginally. Elias spoke softly, casually. "I was out by the South Claim, surveying the Devil's Tooth. I saw where the overseer, Garrett, used to camp. Big tent. Looked like he had a lot of personal effects. Shame they all disappeared." Jedediah flinched. He looked wildly around the saloon, then leaned in close, the smell of cheap liquor heavy on his breath. "Garrett had things that Titus didn't touch, things that Titus didn't want the government to see, and Titus got rid of them. That's why his thugs ran. Not the meat. The other things." Elias's heart pounded. "What other things, Jedediah?" "Papers." Garrett kept a strong box in his tent. It wasn't money, it was documents. He had the names of men back east, senators, rail barons, who were secretly financing his operation. They were planning to steal the entire canyon, not just the iron. They were going to displace every homesteader, every miner, using his claims as a legal pretense. Titus wanted the land to stay local. Garrett's papers would have brought the whole U.S. Army down on Red Rock, clearing everyone out. This explained everything. Titus's motives weren't just simple revenge or profit. They were rooted in a strange, brutal kind of local defense. He had eliminated Garrett to save the town from corporate takeover, and he used Garrett's body to feed them and enforce his own reign of fear, securing their complicity. "Where is that strong box now, Jedediah?" Elias whispered. "Titus burned it all, along with the rest. Up at the ravine. The fire was huge. He made us watch, to remind us why we were quiet." Elias's discovery of the burnt fragments in the large fire pit was confirmed. Titus had not just destroyed a man. He had destroyed the paper trail that threatened the town's very existence, replacing the looming outside threat with his own internal, manageable terror. The next day, Elias realized he couldn't rely on the territorial marshal. The whole process would be too slow, and Titus would simply dispose of Elias the way he disposed of Garrett. He had to create a crisis in Red Rock Canyon that would force the town to confront Titus. He returned to Titus's meat market during the early afternoon, a time when the butcher was usually resting. He found the door locked, but the same heavy padlock. He picked the lock again, with far less trepidation this time, fueled by a new, desperate resolve. He went straight to the strong room, pulled out the latest ledger, and flipped to the page with the special reserve meat stock, no-cost entry. Elias took out a small vial of indelible ink he used for marking survey stones. With a steady hand, he meticulously altered the ledger. He didn't change the no-cost. That was Titus's proud admission. He changed the date of the first entry. The actual first entry was made the day after Garrett disappeared. Elias pushed the date back by 3 weeks, to a time when Garrett was still very much alive, ordering supplies and terrorizing the town. Then he added a small forged entry under the heading, using a handwriting style that mimicked Garrett's florid script. Invoice for 500 LABs. Prime beef for personal use. Elias then rubbed the ink until the page looked slightly smudged and worn. He put the ledger back exactly as he found it. Elias had just planted a fatal inconsistency in Titus's otherwise perfect narrative. The town believed Titus was their savior, eliminating Garrett after weeks of his tyranny. The altered ledger now suggested that Garrett had purchased the 500 lbs of prime beef 3 weeks before his disappearance. But Titus's new entry showed he had already begun processing the special reserve meat stock at that time. The new ledger entry now implied two things that shattered the town's comfortable lie. 1. The jerky predates the murder. Titus had begun selling the mysterious jerky while Garrett was still overseer, meaning it wasn't a sudden life-saving measure, but a pre-planned, calculated act of control. 2. The sacrifice was unnecessary. If Titus was already running a profitable, special reserve operation, the murder of Garrett was not a necessary evil to save the town, but a personal power grab masked by a heroic act. Elias locked the strong room and left, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he had set a fuse. He was counting on the meticulousness of Titus to notice the forged entry, and the inherent distrust of the townspeople to see the lie when the butcher had to explain it. He had moved the focus from what Titus was selling to when he started selling it, twisting the butcher's heroic narrative into a terrifying confession of cold-blooded ambition. The next day, Elias went about his official duties with a heightened sense of theatrical calm. He knew Titus would discover the ledger change soon, perhaps the very moment he went to tally his profits. Elias needed to be visible and appear completely unconcerned. He spent the morning in the saloon, ostensibly working on his maps, but secretly watching the faces of the miners. He noticed that the supply of jerky on the bar counter seemed lower than usual. It happened around mid-afternoon. The front door of Titus's meat market burst open with a violent slam that echoed across the dusty street. Titus emerged, his face a mask of black rage, his massive hands clutching the canvas-bound ledger. He stormed directly toward the Golden Nugget Saloon, his eyes darting frantically. The noise in the saloon died instantly. Titus stopped just inside the doors, his breath coming in ragged, furious gasps. He scanned the room, his gaze finally settling on Elias, who was calmly sipping his coffee. "Vance!" Titus roared, his voice shaking the rafters. "You were in my strong room. You touched my books." Elias rose slowly, maintaining a carefully cultivated expression of shock and offense. "Mr. Titus, I assure you, I have been working on the canyon boundary all morning. I have no interest in your business books." Titus threw the ledger onto a nearby poker table, the impact sending chips scattering. "Then explain this." He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the altered entry, the one that placed the special reserve meat stock sale before Garrett's disappearance. "This wasn't here. It was added." The miners crowded around the table, their fear of Titus warring with their deep, ingrained curiosity. Silas, the bartender, pale with dread, wiped his hands nervously on a rag. An invoice from Garrett for 500 lbs of prime beef? One of the miners, a gaunt man named Hank, read aloud. "But it's dated 3 weeks before the disappearance, and the special reserve entry is dated the same day." Titus spun on the miners, his eyes blazing. "It's a forgery. Vance did it. He wants to turn you all against me." "But why would Vance know about the special reserve entry, Titus?" Another miner, Caleb, asked tentatively. "Only you know what's in your books. Only you know that stock is no cost." The question hung in the air like smoke. It was the crack in the foundation that Elias had been looking for. The miners knew that the no-cost entry was a secret only Titus and perhaps Silas knew. For Elias to forge an entry related to that secret, he would have had to know the secret in the first place. Unless Titus himself had let the information slip, Or more plausibly, Titus was covering up an earlier, more calculated crime. Titus was losing control, his rage destroying the cool, calculating persona that had kept the town in line. "I am the man who saved you. Garrett was a monster. I made sure he couldn't hurt you anymore. Now you doubt me over a piece of paper?" Hank, the miner, pointed a finger at the jerky rack on the bar. "You told us you killed Garrett after he threatened the water rights. You told us the jerky was a necessary evil to keep us fed and quiet after the fight. But this says you were already processing that meat 3 weeks earlier. That means you planned it. That means it wasn't to save us. It was to take over." The town's carefully constructed silence began to fracture. The terror of Titus was immense, but the terror of having been fooled by their savior, of having been eating the product of a calculated, premeditated murder rather than an act of justifiable saving violence, was worse. Elias stepped forward, his voice calm and clear, cutting through Titus's sputtering fury. "The timeline is the only thing that matters, Mr. Titus. If you were already preparing your special reserve while Garrett was still alive, it means his elimination was a cold, economic calculation, not an act of self-defense for the town. It means you saw Garrett's life as a raw material for your immense profit, and you used his tyranny as an excuse to murder him and gain control." Titus lunged, a terrifying, guttural sound tearing from his throat. Elias, anticipating the move, threw his chair into the butcher's legs, stumbling Titus just long enough for Silas to grab an old shotgun from behind the bar. "Stop, Titus!" Silas shouted, his voice shaking. "Don't make this worse!" Titus froze, a look of profound betrayal and hatred directed at Elias. He knew he was trapped. The physical act of the murder was a necessary secret, but the public perception of the motive was his true source of power. Elias had robbed him of the heroic narrative. Titus snatched the ledger off the table. "You will regret this, Vance. This town belongs to me." He stormed out of the saloon, leaving behind a profound, uncertain silence. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a burning resentment. The men who had been complicit in the silence now felt like victims of a deeper, more cynical manipulation. Elias had broken the spell, but he hadn't yet secured the victory. Titus was wounded, but still lethal. Elias had to solidify his proof before Titus came back for him. The terrifying truth has been revealed. The butcher is cornered, but he's never been more dangerous. Don't get cut out of the final acts of this horrific Western drama. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell right now. Your support is what keeps the light on in the darkest corners of Red Rock Canyon. The fear in Red Rock Canyon was now a volatile mix of panic and rebellion. The miners, stripped of their comforting narrative of a necessary evil, now saw Titus as a ruthless opportunist. They had been eating the results of a cold-blooded murder for profit, and the realization made their stomachs turn. Elias knew Titus would be planning his revenge, and the only remaining physical evidence, the button, the cloth, and the actual truth of the ledger, was insufficient against a butcher who still controlled the supply of food and the town's mood. He sought out Silas. The bartender was frantically polishing the bar, his hands still trembling. "Titus will kill me, Silas," Elias stated simply. "And then he will blame me for the ledger change and regain control. We have to act now. What can we do, Vance? He's one man, but he's like a force of nature. He can outfight any 5 men here." "He has one weakness," Elias said, his voice hard. "He values his control and his profits above everything, and his stronghold is the strong room. The actual unaltered ledger is still there. The only proof that can't be dismissed as a forgery is the consistent, special reserve meat stock, no cost entry over the entire 11 months. We can't get in. He'll be guarding it now. We don't go to him, we draw him out," Elias explained, outlining his plan. Titus's operation depends on the nightly smoking of the Jerky. That smokehouse is directly behind the market, right next to the strongroom. Tonight, we hit the smokehouse. The plan was risky, relying on the town's sudden, shared outrage. Silas, now seeing his own life on the line for witnessing the truth, reluctantly agreed to help. They brought the three most level-headed miners into the confidence: Hank, Caleb, and Jedediah, the young man who had inadvertently supplied the truth about Garrett's papers. That night, under a sky completely devoid of moonlight, the five men crept toward the meat market. The entire town was dark. They approached from the back alley. A faint, low light could be seen spilling from a crack in the strongroom door. Titus was inside, no doubt protecting his treasure, his ledgers, and his money. Elias carried a bucket of water mixed with coal dust, a flammable, pungent mixture. Hank and Caleb carried thick, dry mining timbers. "He's inside, guarding the books," Elias whispered. "We hit the smokehouse first. We make him choose between his records and his livelihood." They set the dry timbers against the exterior wall of the smokehouse. With a swift, coordinated effort, they ignited the wood. The smoke was immediate and thick, but it was the small, crackling sound of the rapidly spreading fire that was the key. A minute later, the strongroom door burst open. Titus emerged, a heavy axe in one hand, his face contorted in a ferocious snarl. He saw the flames licking up the side of the smokehouse. The Jerky, his primary source of profit and control, was in danger. "You cowards!" Titus roared, abandoning his post by the ledger. He swung the axe, chopping at the timbers in a desperate attempt to extinguish the fire. This was Elias's window. While Titus was distracted, Elias, Silas, and Jedediah darted for the strongroom. Elias picked the lock, their hands working in a frenzy of shared fear and purpose. The door swung open. The room was exactly as Elias remembered it. He went straight to the iron-bound chest. Titus wouldn't keep all his money in the chest. He keeps something even more important here, Elias surmised, pulling frantically at the lid. The chest was heavy, but unlocked. Inside, tucked beneath several bundles of cash, was a small, ornate leather box. Elias opened it. Inside was not more money, but a collection of 3 gold signet rings, all engraved with a noble family crest, a crest that Elias recognized from the stagecoach gossip as belonging to the family-funding overseer Garrett. Next to the rings was a meticulously drawn but unofficial will and testament dated 3 days before Garrett's disappearance. The will was a masterpiece of legal malice. It didn't leave property to family. It legally ceded all of Garrett's holdings, including his claims and his personal assets, to Titus in the event of Garrett's sudden, untimely demise. The truth crashed down on Elias with devastating force. Garrett's elimination was not an act of self-defense, nor was it a simple takeover. It was murder for the sake of an inheritance. Titus had either coerced Garrett into signing the will, or more chillingly, he was in cahoots with the Eastern financiers, cutting out Garrett to take the claims for himself. The Jerky was simply a grotesque but effective way to conceal the crime and control the town. "This changes everything," Elias gasped, showing the will to Silas. "He didn't just kill him, he legally stole his life. He planned it all, weeks in advance." Suddenly, the air filled with the deafening crack of the axe chopping through the strongroom door. Titus, realizing the fire was out but the strongroom was breached, was now coming for them. "Get out!" Silas screamed, pushing Elias and Jedediah out the back window of the room. "Take the box, I'll hold him." Elias hesitated, but the sound of the axe splitting the wood was too close. He clutched the box and the ledger and scrambled out into the darkness. Just as he landed, the door splintered and Titus burst through. A loud, sickening thud indicated the confrontation that ensued between the butcher and the bartender. Elias ran into the desert night, the gold rings and the will in his satchel, knowing that Silas had sacrificed himself to buy the surveyor the precious few minutes he needed to escape with the only truth that mattered. Elias ran until his lungs burned, the fear for Silas driving him through the scrub and shale. He didn't stop until he reached the relative cover of the nearby rock formations. The distant smoke of the fire at the meat market was a grim beacon. He rested for a moment, examining the contents of the box. The will and the signet rings were irrefutable proof of Titus's motive and premeditation. The jerky and the ledger were simply the chilling methods of concealment and control. He knew Titus would be coming for him. The butcher could not afford to let the will fall into the hands of the territorial authorities. Just as the first sliver of false dawn appeared, Elias heard the sound of a horse approaching at a fast clip. He scrambled behind a thick, sheltering boulder, pulling the utility knife from his belt. Titus appeared on his massive draft horse, a shadow against the graying sky. He was not wearing his apron, and the axe was slung across his back. He was focused, deadly, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the surveyor. Titus pulled the horse to a stop directly opposite Elias's hiding spot, the horse's heavy breathing echoing in the stillness. "Vance?" Titus's voice was strained, heavy with a murderous intent that eclipsed all previous rage. "You can't run forever. You think you're a hero. You think you saved this town." Elias remained silent, the knife slick in his hand. "I saved them from the east. Garrett's backers were going to strip this land bare, take the water, and leave this canyon a graveyard. I stopped them. I cut out the cancer and used the poison to feed the sick. They were grateful until you showed them a ledger. You showed them the price, but not the alternative." "The price was your soul, Titus," Elias finally called out, his voice shaking but steady. "And the price was Silas's life." Titus dismounted with surprising agility, his eyes instantly tracking the sound of Elias's voice. He started walking toward the boulder, his hand resting on the axe handle. Silas was a fool. He chose a moral conscience over a full belly. A poor exchange. But you are a fool with a pen. You think your little papers will stop me? I'll burn this will. I'll burn you, and the town will return to its stable silence. I control their fear. I control their hunger. That's more power than any judge or marshal has in this territory. You control their complicity, Titus, Elias countered, backing away slowly, forcing the butcher to step over the rough terrain. That's the difference. They knew Garrett was evil. They thought you were a necessary monster. But the will proves you were nothing but a common thief and a murderer. You destroyed one tyranny only to impose your own, colder one. Titus lunged, not with the axe, but with a horrifying speed, grabbing at Elias's satchel. The strap tore, and the satchel flew open, scattering the contents onto the dusty ground. The button, the cloth, the forged ledger note, and the precious leather box. Elias scrambled back, pulling a heavy surveying chain from the dirt. Titus ignored him, his focus entirely on the leather box. He smashed his boot down on the box, crushing the delicate wood, then tore the will from the debris. He began to shred the document, his face contorted in a triumphant snarl. Elias knew he had to stop him. He swung the heavy surveying chain. It whipped through the air and wrapped around Titus's huge leg. Elias pulled back with all his weight, the sudden sharp movement catching the butcher off balance. Titus roared in pain and fell heavily, his head hitting a sharp outcropping of shale with a sickening crack. The axe flew from his grasp and landed far away. Elias stood over him, panting, the surveying chain still in his hands. Titus lay still, a thick stream of dark blood pooling quickly beneath his head, already soaking into the dry soil of the canyon. Elias cautiously approached the body. The immense, terrifying butcher was gone, replaced by a broken man. He reached down and recovered the shredded pieces of the will and the intact gold signet rings. The immediate threat was over, but the full, horrific truth had yet to be revealed. Elias gathered the pieces of evidence, the rings, the shards of the will, the button, and began the long, arduous journey back toward the canyon rim. He wasn't heading to Red Rock Canyon. He was heading east, toward the nearest telegraph office where he could alert the territorial marshal. As he walked, the sun finally crested the horizon, washing the desolate canyon in a searing, beautiful light. The horror was not in the landscape, but in the chilling reminder that the worst kind of evil is often the most human. The calculated, premeditated violence committed for money, and the silence it buys from a desperate community. Elias rode for 2 days straight, pushing the rented mule to its limit, until he reached the small rail town of Oak Haven, where he immediately telegraphed the territorial marshal, detailing the murder, the inheritance scheme, and the overwhelming evidence. 2 days later, the marshal and a contingent of deputies rode into Red Rock Canyon. Elias returned with them, a witness and a guide, but no longer a surveyor. The town was in a state of grim chaos. The fire at the smokehouse had been put out, but the market was closed. The miners were restless, having gone without their special reserve jerky for days, and the food shortage was already beginning to bite. The marshal's men found Titus's body exactly where Elias had left it. The official cause of death was ruled as a fall during the struggle with Elias, who was cleared based on self-defense and the overwhelming evidence he produced. The gold rings, the will fragments, and his meticulously documented field notes detailing the disturbed ground and burnt remains. The marshal addressed the gathered townspeople in front of the silent, imposing meat market. He presented the will fragments and the signet rings, explaining Titus's true motive: the pre-planned, cynical murder of Garrett for the sake of an inheritance and the complete control of the mining claims. "Titus didn't save you out of altruism," the marshal announced, his voice ringing with authority. "He murdered a tyrant to become a richer, colder tyrant, and the product he used to control and feed you, the special reserve, was the body of the man he killed." A low, collective moan of horror and revulsion went through the crowd. The psychological terror finally broke them. Many ran to the town pump, violently purging their stomachs of the awful, long-standing secret they had knowingly or unknowingly consumed. The silence of complicity had been shattered by a scream of self-disgust. Silas, battered but alive, was found locked in the strong room, having survived the attack by barricading himself after being struck. He emerged pale and unsteady, but his testimony confirmed Elias's account and further condemned Titus. The town was left with a terrible reckoning. They had allowed fear and hunger to lead them into a grotesque Faustian bargain. They were not just victims of Titus, they were beneficiaries of his crime. Elias, his official surveying duties now secondary, was tasked with organizing a proper cleanup of the canyon. The meat market was razed to the ground, the wood burned to ashes, and the soil beneath the strong room was excavated and salted. The gold from Titus's personal cash and the recovered land claims were placed into receivership, eventually used to pay for the return of proper supply lines and to establish a legitimate, non-exploitative mining operation overseen by the territorial office. Red Rock Canyon was finally free, not just from the monster Garrett, but from the monster Titus and the pervasive culture of fear they both imposed. Before he left Red Rock for good, Elias found Jedediah, Hank, and Caleb standing near the ruins of the market. "Thank you, Vance," Hank said quietly. "You didn't just bring the law. You brought the truth. That's harder to swallow than the meat ever was." "What will you do now?" Elias asked. Jedediah shrugged, looking out at the endless desert. "We'll work, we'll eat proper beef, and we'll try to forget the taste of the silence. It will take a long time." Elias nodded. He understood. The horror was not in the supernatural, but in the depth of human depravity and the fragility of morality when faced with starvation and terror. He had set out to map boundaries, and in the end, he had mapped the true, terrifying limits of human endurance and corruption. Elias Vance rode away from Red Rock Canyon, leaving behind the town and its terrible secret. The experience had aged him, replacing the naive Easterner with a man hardened by a confrontation with pure, human evil. He carried no gold and no fame, only the knowledge that he had found the true boundary between survival and monstrosity. And he had pulled a terrified community back from the brink of a consuming darkness. The desert was quiet, but the silence he now carried was a profound, weary peace. Not the chilling, complicit silence of a town feeding on a lie.